I'm starting out by lightening my graphite outline using a kneaded eraser. And this eraser is great because unlike a normal eraser, if you press and lift with this, you can actually remove some of the excess graphite while still leaving a faint line there. Whereas a normal eraser can actually remove the entire line, and sometimes it can damage your paper with the rubbing as well. The first thing that I'm going to do is work on the background. And I want to have an out of focus background for this, and the easiest way for me to do that with watercolors is to use the wet on wet technique. And this just means that your paper is wet before you start to add your colors, whereas the wet on dry technique means that you're painting on dry paper. So the wet on wet technique creates a nice soft look because the edges and the colors fade into each other, whereas the wet on dry allows more crisp lines and the edges of your brushstrokes will stay crisp. So I've just come through with a damp brush and wet the entire background with water. I don't want there to be puddles of water, it just needs to be slightly damp and glistening. And then I'm just coming through with different colours to match the flowers in the reference photo. The shapes don't have to be perfect because it is out of focus, so I'm just concentrating on getting the general gist of those flowers and leaves by getting the colours in the right spot, but I'm not too fussed about having the shape look exactly like a flower. And you'll notice that the colours start to bleed into each other and there's no harsh edges with this technique. Once I've completed this layer, I'm going to let it dry, and then I'm going to add in another layer on the background and using a slightly different technique this time. So I'm starting out with dry paper, but I will be painting all of my colours in the background before the paper dries. So that way it's going to create softer edges between each colour, but the colours won't spread quite as much as having the entire paper wet to start with. I'm also fixing up any areas that I don't like the look of and adjusting my colours as I go along as well. I'm using a cold pressed watercolour paper today, which is more textured than a hot pressed watercolour paper is, which is quite smooth. The two brands of paper that I like are the Fabriano Artistico or the Arches or Arche cotton papers. And you don't have to have a cold pressed paper. I just find that for more expressive pieces like this one, it just tends to look a little bit nicer, but you can use the hot pressed watercolor paper if that's what you have. And I'm painting with the Schmincke Horadam Aquarelle watercolors, and I'm sure that's not how you pronounce the name. But if you don't have this brand of watercolor to create this piece, a lot of people like to use the Winsor & Newton professional or student grade watercolors. And I've also used the Van Gogh, which are also pretty nice. One of the techniques that I love using with watercolor paintings is adding splatters. All I'm doing for this is taking some watercolor from my pan, making sure that it's quite wet, and then I'm just tapping the back of my paintbrush so that the paint splatters onto the painting. You can do this with a variety of different colors as well to make it look a little bit more interesting. And if you do this technique on a wet surface, the edges will be a lot softer and they fade out quite a bit, just like the wet on wet technique. Whereas if your paper is dry, the splatters will have harsher edges. And I like to do a combination of both of those techniques throughout the process. I'm adding some darker colors to the background, focusing on the edges and the corners because having those darker edges will actually help bring the viewer's attention into the center of the painting. For the main flower itself, I'm working on each petal separately. And this way I can add a few different colors and they'll blend softly into each other in that petal without going into the next petal. I'm also working on the opposite petal across the flower next, so that way my paint won't fade into the petal that's next to it, and it gives it enough time for that first petal to dry before moving on to the areas that are touching it. And this will also help keep those defined lines around each of the petals. And because this flower is the main focal point, I want the lines and the colours to be a lot more crisp and accurate in comparison to the out of focus background. So by working on each petal separately, that will help keep those crisp details. Flower petals also tend to have these kind of lighter veins or stripes going from the center of the flower out to the edge of the petal. To help create those lighter lines, I'm actually taking my damp brush and I'm lifting some of the wet paint to reveal some of that white of the paper through those colors. I'm going to add a few layers to the flower, letting it dry in between each layer. If you start out with a lighter layer of colour and then continue to build up your layers until you get the saturation of the colour that you're after, it will look a lot more interesting and natural than if you tried to get all of your colours in the first layer. So by having multiple light layers, it gives you a lot more depth to your painting because those colours and strokes from your previous layers will actually show through in your end result. I also love using gouache to create highlights on my watercolour paintings. And if you don't know what gouache is, it's basically an opaque watercolour, which means that you can use it to come over the top of your watercolour and it will create brighter highlights. Some watercolour artists don't like the idea of using gouache and consider it cheating, their reasoning being that you should use the white of the paper for your highlights, but for me personally, I find it 10 times easier just to use the gouache at the end for those highlights, and it's actually archival and light fast to use with watercolour, and it makes the process a lot more enjoyable for me, which is kind of the whole reason that we choose to do art in the first place. I have another expressive watercolour tutorial in the top left of the screen where you can learn to paint a turtle step by step. So click on that and I'll see you over there.